Okay, so here again is the twofold aspect of the sermonic undertaking, the discernment of the theology of the pericope and move from text to theology. I ended the previous session with my mentioning my participation in an ETS session a few years ago where each speaker dealt with the 1 Samuel 17 David and Goliath story from multiple hermeneutical viewpoints. One of my co-presenters, Dennis Johnson, addressed a Christocentric interpretation of the narrative. He found a parallel between 1 Samuel 17:45, which says, I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, and Psalm 118:26, which also says, in similar fashion, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, which we know from the New Testament prophetically refers to Jesus. As well, the David story has a stone. And David took a stone and slung it and killed the Philistine. And Psalm 118 has a stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. So David comes in the name of the Lord and Jesus comes in the name of the Lord. David took a stone to kill Goliath and Jesus is the stone of Psalm 118 as the New Testament tells us. So voila, David equals Jesus. If Christ is not preached from every text, Christocentric interpreters tell us we are preaching moralism, especially if we dare make applicational lessons from the life of David or Abraham or Joshua or Caleb or Joseph. That's a common argument. Moralism, synagogue sermons, you've heard those before. But biblical evidence actually shows that such accusations are not exactly correct. The Bible itself makes moral examples, positive or negative, of its characters. James 2 provides Abraham and Rahab as examples of good works. James 5 speaks of the prophets, of Job, of Elijah who prayed. Moreover, Jesus himself frequently exhorted his listeners to imitate characters in his teaching. The wise builder in Matthew 7, David himself in Mark 2, the Good Samaritan in Luke 10, which actually concludes with the express injunction, go and do likewise. You might ask, but doesn't the New Testament support the idea of finding Christ in every pericope? What about Luke 24 and beginning with Moses and with all the prophets Jesus explained to them, to the Emmaus disciples, the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. Notice that last phrase, he explained to them the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. Does that mean that all the scriptures explicitly talk about Jesus? A couple of years ago, Dallas Seminary's catalog mentioned me by name in 4 different places. You know where this is going, right? Now say that I explained those references to me to my students in class. Abe Kuruvilla explained to his class the things concerning himself in all the catalog, those 4 references. If Jesus' similar explanation meant that all the scriptures talked explicitly about him, then what I said in my class means the entire DTS catalog talks about me, Abe Kuruvilla. I want you to notice that 24:27 of Luke, Jesus mentions to those disciples only those things concerning himself. So also in verse 44, all the things which are written about me must be fulfilled. Jesus is not finding himself in all the texts of Scripture, but finding just those texts that concern himself. The potential problem with a Christocentric approach to finding Christ in every pericope is that specific thrusts of the Old Testament, and this is particularly a problem with Old Testament interpretation, specific thrusts of Old Testament texts get neglected, making the value of preaching from the Old Testament doubtful at best. Let me explain how I looked at the David and Goliath story a little differently. Let me show you what I did. The actual battle action is reported in a mere 3 verses. But the narrative of 1 Samuel 17 takes all of 58 verses in the Masoretic text to tell us this: David kills Goliath. There is no doubt that this expansion, this dilatation is with purpose. The author is doing something with all of those 58 verses to tell us that David killed Goliath. We'll see that this story points to 3 elements: the stature, resources, and experiences of each of the 3 protagonists in the story: the giant, the king, and the youth. So, this is what you're going to see: stature, resources, experience, each of those of the giant, king, and of the youth. Let's examine each one in turn. The giant's stature is fearsome. Masoretic text, it's a little different from the Septuagint. Masoretic text tells us he was 9 feet 9 inches tall. So his stature is considerable. Then there is a list of his resources, which is the longest description of military gear in the Old Testament. Helmet, armor, greaves, which are leg protectors, scimitar, spear, and sword. This huge enemy is overwhelmingly bedecked. It was not only his stature and his resources that were threatened. His considerable experience also rendered him a lethal enemy to tangle with. In fact, Saul acknowledged that Goliath had been a man of war from his youth. His experience was considerable. Stature, resources, experience. He has them all. And of course, seeing the stature, resources, experience of the giant, Saul and his army could do only one thing: flee in panic. And we are told that twice. 11 and 24. So that's the giant. Then there's King Saul. Remarkably, if Goliath was sizable, so also was Saul. The text specifically tells us that Saul was literally head and shoulders above his compatriots, and we're told that twice. In other words, Saul had the requisite stature to take on the giant. What about his resources? If Goliath had intimidating weapons, so also did Saul. In fact, Saul's weapons were likely to have been the best in the land, ones that only the royal family possessed. Nobody else in Israel had swords or spears. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had. And ironically, the Philistines' ideology of weapons seems to have been shared by Saul too. The king, remember, tries to clothe David with his own royal armaments, the description of which is uncannily similar to the inventory of Goliath's weapons. Both king and giant employ helmets on their heads, armor, and sword. For Saul figures that victory can only be achieved by matching helmet for helmet, armor for armor, sword for sword. Weapons, you see, have to be countered with more weapons. So in stature and resources, Saul was up to the task of fighting Goliath. And his experience, the king's experience, was nothing to be sniffed at either. Let me tell you why. In 1710, Goliath